Hola, Econ peeps. Let's go ahead and dive into Module 10, the income-expenditure model, okay? Which I've also heard described as the aggregate expenditure model, but that's all right. It's also known as the Keynesian cross, okay? So Keynes' economic theories really became renowned in the 30s during the Great Depression. He was an English economist. And his model, this income expenditure, Keynesian cross, aggregate expenditures model, all of this predates the popularization of the ASAD model, which is the dominant model that I'll certainly be using for much of the remainder of this course, and really is what drives much of the discussion around the intro macro concepts that we're discussing in this class. All right. So a big important concept that we're going to begin to lay some of the foundation for is this idea of the expenditure multiplier. We talked about this. There are really three multipliers that we have in this class. Mainly going to focus on two of them. Okay, but there's a spending or a fiscal multiplier. All right, so this is a multiplier that applies to government spending primarily, but also to business spending and any kind of general spending, consumer spending, any of that. That's going to, I think I've explained this before. You have 20, you get an extra $20 that you didn't have last week, and you're going to spend some part of that and save some part of it. That, let's say 80% that you spend is $16. You go spend that $16. Well, whoever you spend that $16 with is going to take that $16 and they're going to put 80% of it back out in the economy, right? And so forth and so on. The reality is that when you need to close one of those gaps in the economy, if you have a recession and you need to close that recessionary gap, or you're having inflation, you need to close that inflationary gap, then whatever policy you decide to use to facilitate that closing, you need to account for the spending multiplier. If you've got a $5 billion shortfall in output that's causing a recessionary gap to open, an inefficient allocation of your resources, then you don't want to increase spending, for example, by $5 billion, because the multiplier will make you overshoot that by a mile and you'll be over an inflationary gap. So this will begin to make more sense as we move through. This is the last module in this unit, and in the next unit we're going to start. We're going to spend about the first three modules talking about this idea of policy making, okay, using these models, and we're also going to complete the next unit with a discussion of the global economy, right? So, all right. There's the spending multiplier, but there's also a tax multiplier. All right. There's also a tax multiplier, and there is a money multiplier. All right. And we'll get into these multipliers. Certainly the money multiplier when we discuss money and monetary policy. Okay. All right. So there is a function that we can, a sort of mathematical function that will describe the graphical relationship that exists between national income as a function of aggregate expenditure, or the value of all the goods produced in the economy. Aggregate expenditure is really just another way of saying GDP using the expenditure approach. Remember, when you calculate GDP, there's two different ways. There's the income approach. We really don't do much with that. And then there's this expenditure approach. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumer spending, business spending, government spending, net exports. Got to know it. Got to know it. Now you kind of understand why you got to know it, because it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Okay? It's kind of the fundamental equation of macroeconomics, is this idea that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, right? That right there. And then X is net exports, which is X minus N. Okay? Now, there is a relationship between national income and aggregate expenditures. And this is, again, it's output, Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. That's what they're saying here. Defined as consumption, business spending, government spending, and net exports. All right. Then there's that aggregate expenditure schedule. All right. And this is the function in tabular format. Okay. As we talked about briefly in the last module, Keynes focuses on demand, right? So there is no supply or price level in this model. So aggregate expenditures, GDP output, is both a measure of both the values of the spending on final goods as well as the value of the production of those final goods. So in some way, supply is at least almost kind of implicitly snuck into this model through GDP, but not really, because that's primarily aggregate demand. But again, typically demand is what's, according to Keynes' theory, demand drives supply. So that's where that can come from. So again, here's aggregate expenditure, or GDP, or Y. We frequently use Y. You'll see it down here. All right. All right. And there's that's a little trend line like in the business cycle, isn't it? Okay. All right. So some definitions. We'll have to pause several times during the course of this lecture to talk about some new ideas. This idea of autonomous consumption. This is the consumption that occurs even if you don't have any income, right? So it's the amount consumers spend when Y is 0. Okay? I know that probably doesn't make any sense, but they can borrow money. And in aggregate, we actually spend more than we bring in. If you were to calculate GDP in both the income approach, how much money we make, and the expenditure approach, how much money we spend, you'd find that the expenditure approach is a little bit higher than the income approach. We're clever in economics. We just call that a statistical discrepancy. But it implies, again, that we, as a society, we tend to, most of us, spend more than we make. So any of that excess above that would be considered what we call autonomous spending. Okay? Then again, there's a consumption function, right, which explains that graphical relationship that exists between national income and consumer spending, right? And the formula for this function is simply consumer spending is autonomous spending plus something called the marginal propensity to consume times aggregate output or spending, consumer total output, Y. Right? So marginal propensity to consume is that fraction of any change in your income that you spend. Remember, we either spend our money or we save our money. So there's a marginal propensity to save, and the sum of these two marginal propensities must equal 1. It's got to be 1. All right? So the consumption function, and you don't necessarily, I'm not going to be asking a whole lot of questions about these functions, okay? We're going to skip a number of these slides where they go into detail about how to calculate aggregate expenditures algebraically. I'm not going to do that in here. We certainly could. I think that's more better for like a intermediate macro class. Certainly do it at the intermediate. They'll also introduce a whole nother model called the ISLM model. But that's, to me, that's a little bit outside the scope of an introductory macro course. We do plenty of stuff in here that we don't have to introduce a whole bunch of extra math. At least I feel like we do a lot in here. All right. So, any additional income consumers get, they either spend it or they save it. That fraction of the additional income that they've gotten, that they spend, is known as the marginal propensity to consume. And that fraction of additional income that they save, that is known as the marginal propensity to save. And you can see that they have an algebraic definition, right? The change, that triangle, if you don't know that, that triangle here is a Greek letter. It's frequently used in mathematics to denote change, delta C. This triangle's delta, the Greek letter delta. And so it's the change in consumer spending divided by the change in total output. That is your marginal propensity to consume, right? So what they're doing here is they're taking that fraction of additional income that you spend and multiplying it by your total output to get consumer spending, right? And then have to add in the autonomous consumption. All right, so how does consumption increase with the level of national income? Obviously, everything that gets produced and sold, the value of all final output, is income for somebody. and at a national income level of zero, $600, 600 billion, 600 trillion, whatever it might be, is consumed. Then each time income rises by 1,000, consumption rises by 800. Because in this example here, marginal propensity to consume is 80% or 0.8. And that means that 80% of every additional dollar they get, they're going to spend 80 cents of it. Okay, so for every $1,000, they're going to spend $800 of it. $200 goes to savings. Right? All right. So the aggregate expenditure function is that relationship between national income as a function of total output. The schedule is that function in tabular format. Autonomous expenditures is all the components of aggregate expenditure which do not change based on national income, right? So autonomous consumption, if there's any autonomous business spending, autonomous government spending, any spending that has to occur even if total taxes were zero. If total tax revenue, I should say, was zero, that kind of thing. All right. Then there's, just like we have one for consumers, we have a function that explains government spending, business spending, and spending on exports and imports. There's something, we're not going to deal with this much, but there's this idea you can apply marginal propensities to any number of concepts. Here they apply it to imports, right? That fraction of any change in income which is spent. This is defined as the change in imports divided by the ratio of those changes, the ratio of the change in imports to the change in output, total output, right? That's your marginal propensity to import. Okay? All right. So here's the investment function, right? It's constant, at least in the short run. It's not, you're not going to, it's business spending does not change based on national income, right? Which is represented here by aggregate expenditures. All right. So it's at 500, stays flat. Quite frankly, the same with government spending. Right here, it looks like it's at 1,300. Oops. I was going to try to highlight that, but here's 1,300, right? And then you can go into net exports, same thing. Okay. Now, here's exports, here's imports. Yeah, we're going to have somewhere kind of that's going to be a drag because we spend more money on imports than foreign consumers spend on our exports. Okay? So here's the whole thing. Here's consumer spending. Then you add in investments, add in government spending, right? Investment being business spending. Add in government expenditure. In this case, we're adding this. I mean, in some economies, it is an addition. But in our case, we run a trade deficit, so that's actually smaller. So ours would actually be down here somewhere. But generally speaking, you're going to add those all together. There's your aggregate expenditures. Okay? So here's all five, right? Here's net exports. Here's consumer spending. Here's consumer business spending. Again, consumer, business, and government spending, and then the combination of them all. All right? Don't worry too much about that. You'll see you'll know what you need to know based on the questions I ask you during this lecture. Excuse me. Still kind of early enough for coffee around here. Consumption function. We've already talked about this. I don't know why they're repeating themselves. This is the same slide we had earlier. Now, there is a 45-degree line that we employ. Right? There's a 45-degree line. It starts here, and it's at a 45-degree angle. In other words, this is a right angle, so it's going to go right down the middle here. And this is the total value of stuff produced in the economy. This is how much money we're spending in the economy. And so this 45-degree line or reference line denotes all the places in this model where output equals expenditures. Okay? At every point along that 45-degree line, so if I were to draw this, up from 5,000 to right here and connect it to the 0, right there, draw a line straight through it, that would be a 45-degree line. Do it at 8,000, right up here. Do it at 3,000, right there. And just start here, draw a line through that. All those places along that line denote places where output equals income and vice versa, right? It's called their expenditure line or reference line this is where the idea of a Keynesian cross comes from. You'll see. So here's our reference line here. This denotes equilibrium, where our aggregate expenditures actually meets output. This is the output, right? If we're actually here in the economy, that would mean that we have a recession. This would denote a recessionary gap. If we are out here on this aggregate expenditure line, we have an inflationary gap. Okay? So when output is less than what we're spending, you're out here, and then when output is greater than our spending, in that case, we're going to have a surplus out here, shortage over here, right? All right. So here's finding equilibrium using algebra. Not going to do it. All right. There's several of those. If you're interested in that, certainly follow up. That's all right. I'll straight to the book. Now, an inflationary gap occurs when macro equilibrium is greater than potential GDP, where actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. All right? We have an inflationary gap, and the natural rate of unemployment, or so-called full employment output, is lower. Right? We're below the natural, I shouldn't say the natural rate of output, unemployment is lower. We're below the natural rate of unemployment. We are operating below full employment output. Right? And that tends to mean the economy is overheated. It's growing a little too fast. The argument is we should slow that down because it's putting inflationary pressure is building behind it. Okay, we're spending more than goods we have. Okay, that potential GDP is drawn as a vertical line, right? In the ASAD model, that would be the long-run average supply curve. It's again, these models basically are taking your business cycle and kind of turning it at a slightly different angle, but it's a very similar model. And here, potential GDP is that vertical line, okay? And that indicates where GDP is at potential, that's where we want to be, all right? And then, of course, you have a recessionary gap when macro equilibrium occurs at a level of GDP that is less than potential, and unemployment should be higher in those cases than the natural rate or at full employment output, okay? All right, so here we have potential GDP, and up here you can see aggregate expenditures is less than output. All right, and potential GDP here means the same thing as it did in the ASAD model. All right, I want to go back because I think I said this wrong. Okay, I want to go right here. When output is greater than aggregate expenditures, then I think maybe I said it right. This is inflationary. This is recessionary, right? We're not recessionary. Usually implies that we left some resources idle. We're not employing all of our resources, right? And so that would occur when output is less than what is available to spend. Okay, I think I said that right. All right, I just want to make sure. Okay, all right. If aggregate expenditure line intersects our reference or 45-degree line at the same spot the potential GDP intersects, then the economy's doing great. We're good. We're at full employment output, as we saw in the ASAD model. But typically, especially with the business cycle, we operate back and forth. We kind of move back and forth. Anything that shifts the aggregate expenditure line down is a potential cause of a recession. So anything that might cause this aggregate expenditure line to fall, any loss in consumer spending, business spending, government spending, or net exports is going to come down. Okay, it's going to come down, and that's going to change where we're at, where we're intersecting this 45-degree reference line. Okay, and so consumers decide to save more money. The dollar is particularly strong, like it is now. It's hard to sell our exports because when the dollar appreciates in value, our stuff gets more expensive relative to foreign goods. And therefore, fewer foreign consumers are going to buy our more expensive stuff, and we're going to buy the less expensive imported stuff. And so exports is coming down, imports is going to go up, and that will exacerbate, in our case, the trade deficit, and that's going to also push that down. All right. So here's ASAD. And this is how the Keynesian economists typically use ASAD. But well, again, there is a short run. There's an immediate short run, long run that we've kind of added on. Now, the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. And remember, because the MPS and MPC have to sum to 1, right? We only save and we only consume. With that in mind, our marginal propensities have to be 100% of the additional income. And so MPS plus MPC is 1. So another way of saying this spending multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. 1 over 1 minus MPC. So if we're given one or the other of these marginal propensities, we can easily find the other one, and we can find the spending multiplier. All right? So any increase in expenditure or a decrease in expenditure is going to result in a larger change in the equilibrium output. Right? So any increase in consumer spending, typically this spending multiplier is going to be primarily applied to government spending, but consumer spending is usually driven by changes to taxes, and that would be the tax multiplier. But that's okay. But changes to government spending. If we increase government spending by $5 billion and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, like in the other example, then the marginal propensity to save is 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is the same as 10 over 2, or 5. So if government increases their spending by $5 billion, guess what? Total output is going to grow by 25 billion, or 5 times 5. Right? 5 times that initial increase. That's the power of the multiplier. Okay? And it works in both ways. If the government spending cuts spending by $5 billion, guess what? Total output is going to fall by 25 billion. So if you have a $10 billion gap, then you don't want to change government spending by more than $2 billion, do you? With a multiplier of 5. See what I'm saying? I hope that made some sense. We'll do more of this in the next unit, but it's important that you understand why we're laying some really important foundation here. Okay? As we have really, to me, throughout the class. Some of you could probably care less. I don't know. But it's unfortunate because you're missing out. But that's your choice. So again, aggregate expenditure, output, that's the same formula, right? We're just the only thing that we're really doing is we're equating total output as being sometimes different than total spending, even though we calculate output using the same formula. I know that sounds a little strange, but we'll get there. All right, and that's all I have. That's as much of this as I want to cover right now. We'll do more of this in the next unit. So this brings an end to this unit. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. Otherwise, best of luck to you. And be safe, be kind, and I'll see you in, I guess, about a week and a half when we start Module 11. Thank you very much.